Revelation 2268 from the 18th of March 1942. Self-love. Little will for redeeming activity. The will for redemptive activity on earth can be called very small because people have increased their distance from God through their way of life, and the ever-increasing distance also signifies ever greater weakness of will. But the distance from God also means a lack of knowledge, and thus the human being does not know about the necessity and blessing of the redeeming activity. He knows nothing about the consequences in the beyond, and therefore does nothing to reduce the state of distance from God. This is a certain boundedness of will, for although the human being's will is free, the adversary still has great power over him, namely when the way of life does not correspond to the divine commandments. The human being certainly has freedom of will in that he can act and think as he pleases, for he cannot be forced by the evil power, nor does God impose any constraint on him. But if his thoughts and aspirations are evil, then he freely turns to the one who once abused his will, and the latter now also appropriates the will of the one who turns to him. And now it is difficult for the human being to use his free will, and this becomes increasingly more difficult the more power he grants God's adversary over him. If the human being wants to become free from his power and also redeem others or help them to do so, then he must do what corresponds to divine will, and he must first practice love. For love is, after all, the counterforce of the adversary, who has completely become lovelessness. Every work of love sets the human being free, for now he detaches himself from the one who wanted to overthrow God's order, who did not acknowledge God as the eternal love and whose power is to rule in complete lack of love. Redeeming activity is therefore every activity whose driving force is love. In the present time, however, the determining factor for all human activity is self-love. Every person thinks only of his own advantage in his work, but the desire to help his fellow human beings through it is rarely present. And therefore such work brings little spiritual success. If people were more God-loving, then the love for the ego would become weaker and weaker, and the love for fellow human beings would increase to the same extent. And then the human being would be urged from within to works of love. He would only ever want to help and become completely free from the control of the unloving power. But since the will for redemptive activity is so rarely found, the adversary has great power on earth. And this expresses itself in the fact that he drives people to ever greater unkindness, and that people willingly follow him and almost outdo each other in works of destruction and in feelings of hatred and revenge. And the distance from God becomes ever greater until they are completely enslaved by the influence of evil again, and this signifies a complete spiritual collapse which, however, God puts a stop to through his power. He wrests the power over the spiritual from his adversary again by banishing it in the form again for an infinitely long time. Amen.